When Eubulus was archon at Athens, the Romans elected as consuls Marcus Fabius and Servius Sulpicius. In this year, Timoleon, the Corinthian, who had been chosen by his fellow citizens to command in Syracuse, made ready for his expedition to Sicily. He enrolled 700 mercenaries and, putting his men aboard 4 triremes and 3 fast-sailing ships, set sail from Corinth. As he coasted along, he picked up 3 additional ships from the Leucadians and the Corcyraeans, and so with 10 ships he crossed the Ionian Gulf. During this voyage, a peculiar and strange event happened to Timoleon. Heaven came to the support of his venture and foretold his coming fame and the glory of his achievements, for all through the night he was preceded by a torch blazing in the sky up to the moment when the squadron made harbour in Italy. Now, Timoleon had heard already in Corinth from the priestesses of Demeter and Persephone that, while they slept, the goddesses had told them that they would accompany Timoleon on his voyage to their sacred island. He and his companions were, in consequence, delighted, recognizing that the goddesses were in fact giving them their support. He dedicated his best ship to them, calling it the sacred ship of Demeter and Persephone. Encountering no hazards, the squadron put in at Metapontum in Italy, and so, shortly after, did a Carthaginian trireme, also bringing Carthaginian ambassadors. Accosting Timoleon, they warned him solemnly not to start a war or even to set foot in Sicily. But the people of Rhegium were calling him and promised to join him as allies, and so Timoleon quickly put out from Metapontum, hoping to outstrip the report of his coming. Since the Carthaginians controlled the seas, he was afraid that they would prevent his crossing over to Sicily. He was then hastily completing his passage to Rhegium. Shortly before this, the Carthaginians on their part had come to see that there would be a serious war in Sicily and began making friendly representations to the cities in the island, which were their ally. Renouncing their opposition to the tyrants throughout the island, they established friendship with them, and particularly they addressed themselves to Hisatas, the most powerful of these, because he had the Syracusans under his control. They prepared and transported to Sicily a large sea and land force of their own, and appointed Hanno to the command as general. They had 150 battleships, 50,000 infantry, 300 war chariots, over 2,000 extra teams of horses, and besides all this, armor and missiles of every description, numerous siege engines, and an enormous supply of food and other materials of war. Advancing first on Entella, they devastated the countryside and blockaded the country people inside the city. The Campanians who occupied the city were alarmed at the odds against them and appealed for help to the other cities that were hostile to the Carthaginians. Of these, none responded except the city of Galeria. These people sent them 1,000 hoplites, but the Phoenicians intercepted them, overwhelmed them with a large force, and cut them all down. The Campanians who dwelt in Aetna were at first also ready to send reinforcements to Entella because of kinship, but when they heard of the disaster to the troops from Galeria, they decided to make no move. Now, at the time when Dionysius was still master of Syracuse, Hisatas had taken the field against it with a large force, and at first constructing a stockaded camp at the Olympieum, carried on war against the tyrant in the city. But as the siege dragged on and provisions ran out, he started back to Leontini, for that was the city which served as his base. Dionysius set out in hot pursuit and overtook his rear, attacking it at once, but Hisatas wheeled upon him, joined battle, and having slain more than 3,000 of the mercenaries, put the rest to flight. Pursuing sharply and bursting into the city with the fugitives, he got possession of all Syracuse except the island. Such was the situation as regards Hisatas and Dionysius. 3 days after the capture of Syracuse, Timoleon put in at Rhegium and anchored off the city. The Carthaginians promptly turned up with 20 triremes, but the people of Rhegium helped Timoleon to escape the trap. They called a general assembly in the city and staged a formal debate on the subject of a settlement. The Carthaginians expected that Timoleon would be prevailed upon to sail back to Corinth and kept a careless watch. He, however, giving no hint of an intention to slip away, remained close to the tribunal, but secretly ordered 9 of his ships to put to sea immediately. Then, while the Carthaginians concentrated their attention on the intentionally long-winded regions, Timoleon stole away unnoticed to his remaining ship and quickly sailed out of the harbour. The Carthaginians, though outmanoeuvred, set out in pursuit, but his fleet had gained a substantial lead, and as night fell, it was able to reach Tauromenium before being overtaken. Andromachus, who was the leading man of this city and had constantly favored the Syracusan cause, welcomed the fugitives hospitably and did much to ensure their safety. Histas now put himself at the head of 5,000 of his best soldiers and marched against the Adranite, who were hostile to him, encamping near their city. Timoleon added to his force some soldiers from Tauromenium and marched out of that city, having all told no more than 1,000 men. Setting out at nightfall, he reached Adranum on the second day and made a surprise attack on Hisatus's men while they were at dinner. Penetrating their defences, he killed more than 300 men, took about 600 prisoners, and became master of the camp. Capping this maneuver with another, he proceeded forthwith to Syracuse. Covering the distance at full speed, he fell on the city without warning, having made better time than those who were routed and fleeing. Such were the events that took place in this year. When Lyciscus was archon at Athens, the Romans elected as consuls Marcus Valerius and Marcus Publius, and the 109th Olympiad was celebrated, in which Aristolochus the Athenian won the foot race. In this year, the first treaty was concluded between the Romans and the Carthaginians. In Caria, Idrius, the ruler of the Carians, died after ruling 7 years, and Ada, his sister and wife, succeeding him, ruled for 4 years. In Sicily, Timoleon took the Adranite and the Tindarite into his alliance and received not a few reinforcements from them. Great confusion reigned in Syracuse, where Dionysius held the island, Histas, Acradina, and Neapolis, and Timoleon the rest of the city, while the Carthaginians had put into the great harbour with 150 triremes and encamped with 50,000 men on the shore. Timoleon and his men viewed the odds against them with dismay, but the prospect took a sudden and surprising change for the better. First Marcus, the tyrant of Catania, came over to Timoleon with a considerable army, and then many of the outlying Syracusan forts declared for him in a move to gain their independence. On top of all this, the Corinthians manned 10 ships, supplied them with money, and dispatched them to Syracuse. Thereupon Timoleon plucked up courage, but the Carthaginians took alarm and unaccountably sailed out of the harbour, returning with all their forces to their own territory. Hisatus was left isolated, while Timoleon victoriously occupied Syracuse. Then he proceeded to recover Messana, which had gone over to the Carthaginians. Such was the state of affairs in Sicily. In Macedonia, Philip had inherited from his father a quarrel with the Illyrians and found no means of reconciling the disagreement. He therefore invaded Illyria with a large force, devastated the countryside, captured many towns, and returned to Macedonia laden with booty. Then he marched into Thessaly, and by expelling tyrants from the cities, won over the Thessalians through gratitude. With them, as his allies, he expected that the Greeks too would easily be won over also to his favour, and that is just what happened. The neighbouring Greeks straightway associated themselves with the decision of the Thessalians and became his enthusiastic allies. When Pythodotus was archon at Athens, the Romans elected as consuls Gaius, Plautius, and Titus Manlius. In this year, Timoleon frightened the tyrant Dionysius into surrendering the citadel, resigning his office and retiring under a safe conduct to the Peloponnese, but retaining his private possessions. Thus, through cowardice and meanness, he lost that celebrated tyranny which had been, as people said, bound with fetters of steel, and spent the remaining years of his life in poverty at Corinth, furnishing in his life and misfortune an example to all who vaunt themselves unwisely on their successes. He who had possessed 400 triremes arrived shortly after in Corinth in a small tub of a freighter, conspicuously displaying the enormity of the change in his fortune. Timoleon took over the island and the forts which had formerly belonged to Dionysius. He razed the citadel and the tyrant's palace on the island and restored the independence of the fortified towns. Straightway, he set to work on a new code of laws, converting the city into a democracy, and specified in exact detail the law of contracts and all such matters, paying special attention to equality. He instituted also the annual office that is held in highest honour, which the Syracusans call the Amphipoly of Zeus Olympius. To this, the first priest elected was Calimenes, the son of Alcades, and henceforth the Syracusans continued to designate the years by these officials down to the time of my writing this history and of the change in their form of government. For when the Romans shared their citizenship with the Greeks of Sicily, The office of these priests became insignificant after having been important for over 300 years. Such was the condition of affairs in Sicily. In Macedonia, Philip conceived a plan to win over the Greek cities in Thrace to his side and marched into that region. Chersobleptes, who was the king of the Thracians, had been following a policy of reducing the Hellespontine cities bordering on his territory and of ravaging their territory. With the aim of putting a stop to the barbarian attacks, Philip moved against them with a large force. He overcame the Thracians in several battles and imposed on the conquered barbarians the payment of a tithe to the Macedonians, and by founding strong cities at key places, made it impossible for the Thracians to commit any outrages in the future. So the Greek cities were freed from this fear and gladly joined Philip's alliance. Theopompus of Chios, the historian, in his History of Philip, included 3 books dealing with affairs in Sicily. Beginning with the tyranny of Dionysius the Elder, he covered a period of 50 years, closing with the expulsion of the younger Dionysius. These 3 books are XVIII. When Sosigenes was archon at Athens, the Romans elected as consuls Marcus Valerius and Marcus Gnaeus Publius. In this year, Orymbus, king of the Molossians, died after a rule of 10 years, leaving a son, Aeacides, Pyrrhus's father, but Alexander, the brother of Olympias, succeeded to the throne with the backing of Philip of Macedon. In Sicily, Timoleon made an expedition against Leontini, for this was the city where Hicetas had taken refuge with a substantial army. He launched an assault on the part called Neapolis, but since the soldiers in the city were numerous and had an advantage in fighting from the walls, he accomplished nothing and broke off the siege. Passing on to the city Engium, which was controlled by the tyrant Leptines, he assailed it with repeated attacks in the hope of expelling Leptines and restoring to the city its freedom. Taking advantage of his preoccupation, Hicetas led out his entire force and attempted to lay siege to Syracuse, but lost many of his men and hastily retreated back to Leontini. Leptines was frightened into submission, and Timoleon shipped him off to the Peloponnese under a safe conduct, giving the Greeks tangible evidence of the results of his program of defeating and expelling tyrants. The city of Apollonia had also been under Leptines. On taking it, Timoleon restored its autonomy as well as that of the city of Engium. Lacking funds to pay his mercenaries, he sent 1,000 men with his best officers into the part of Sicily ruled by the Carthaginians. They pillaged a large area and, carrying off a large amount of plunder, delivered it to Timoleon. Selling this and realizing a large sum of money, he paid his mercenaries for a long term of service. He took Entella also, and, after putting to death the 15 persons who were the strongest supporters of the Carthaginians, restored the rest to independence. As his strength and military reputation grew, all the Greek cities in Sicily began to submit themselves voluntarily to him, thanks to his policy of restoring to all their autonomy. Many too of the cities of the Sicels and the Sicanians, and the rest, who were subject to the Carthaginians, approached him through embassies in a desire to be included in his alliance. The Carthaginians recognized that their generals in Sicily were conducting the war in a spiritless manner and decided to send out new ones, together with heavy reinforcements. Straight away, they made a levy for the campaign from among their noblest citizens and made suitable drafts among the Libyan. Furthermore, appropriating a large sum of money, they enlisted mercenaries from among the Iberians, Celts, and Ligurians. They were occupied also with the construction of battleships. They assembled many freighters and manufactured other supplies in enormous quantities. When Nicomachus was archon at Athens, the Romans elected as consuls Gaius Marcius and Titus Manlius Torquatus. In this year, Phocion, the Athenian, defeated and expelled Clitarchus, the tyrant of Eretria who had been installed by Philip. In Caria, Pisiodorus, the younger of the brothers, ousted Ada from her rule as dynast and held sway for 5 years until Alexander's crossing over into Asia. Philip, whose fortunes were constantly on the increase, made an expedition against Perinthus, which had resisted him and inclined toward the Athenian. He instituted a siege and, advancing engines to the city, assailed the walls in relays day after day. He built towers 80 cubits high, which far overtopped the towers of Perinthus and from a superior height kept wearing down the besieged. He rocked the walls with battering rams and undermined them with saps and cast down a long stretch of the wall. The Perinthians fought stoutly in their own defense and quickly threw up a second wall, Many admirable feats were performed in the open and on the fortification. Both sides displayed great determination. The king, for his part, rained destruction with numerous and varied catapults upon the men fighting steadfastly along the battlements, while the Corinthians, although their daily losses were heavy, received reinforcements of men, missiles, and artillery from Byzantium. When they had again become a match for the enemy, they took courage and resolutely bore the brunt of battle for their homeland. Still, the king persevered in his determination. He divided his forces into several divisions and with frequent reliefs kept up a continuous attack on the walls, both day and night. He had 30,000 men and a store of missiles and siege engines besides other machines in plenty, and kept up a steady pressure against the besieged people. So the siege dragged on. The numbers mounted of dead and wounded in the city and provisions were running short. The capture of the city was imminent. Fortune, however, did not neglect the safety of those in danger, but brought them an unexpected deliverance. Philip's growth to power had been reported in Asia, and the Persian king, viewing this power with alarm, wrote to his satraps on the coast to give all possible assistance to the Corinthians. They consequently took counsel and sent off to Perinthus a force of mercenaries, ample funds, and sufficient stocks of food, missiles, and other materials required for operation. Similarly, the people of Byzantium also sent them their best officers and soldiers. So the armies were again well matched, and as the fighting was resumed, the siege was waged with supreme determination. Philip constantly battered the walls with his rams, making breaches in them, and as his catapults cleared the battlements of defenders, he would at the same moment drive through the breached walls with his soldiers in close formation and assail with scaling ladders the portions of the walls which he had cleared. Then hand-to-hand combat ensued, and some were slain outright, others fell under many wounds. The rewards of victory challenged the daring of the contestants, for the Macedonians hoped to have a wealthy city to sack and to be rewarded by Philip with gifts, the hope of profit steeling them against danger, while the Corinthians had before their eyes the horrors of capture and sustained with great courage the battle for their deliverance. The natural setting of the city greatly aided the besieged Corinthians towards a decisive victory. It lies by the sea on a sort of high peninsula with an isthmus 1 furlong across, and its houses are packed close together and very high. In their construction along the slope of the hill, they overtop one another and thus give the city the general aspect of a theatre. In spite of the constant breaches in the fortifications, consequently, the Corinthians were not defeated, for they blocked up the alleyways and utilized the lowest tier of houses each time as though it were a wall of defense. When Philip with much labor and hard fighting mastered the city wall, he found that the houses afforded a stronger one, ready-made by fortune. Since, in addition, the city's every need was promptly met by supplies coming to Perinthus from Byzantium, he split his forces in two, and leaving one division under his best officers to continue the operations before Perinthus, marched himself with the other, and, making a sudden attack on Byzantium, enclosed that city also in a tight siege. Since their men and weapons and war equipment were all at Perinthus, the people of Byzantium found themselves seriously embarrassed. Such was the situation at Perinthus and Byzantium. Ephorus of Syme, the historian, closed his history at this point with the siege of Perinthus, having included in his work the deeds of both the Greeks and the barbarians from the time of the return of the Heraclida. He covered a period of almost 750 years, writing 30 books and prefacing each with an introduction. Diodorus, the Athenian, began the second section of his history with the close of Ephorus's and made a connected narrative of the history of Greeks and barbarians from that point to the death of Philip. When Theophrastus was archon at Athens, the Romans elected as consuls Marcus Valerius and Aulus Cornelius, and the 110th Olympiad was celebrated, in which Anticles the Athenian won the foot race. In this year, seeing that Philip was besieging Byzantium, the Athenians voted that he had broken his treaty with them and promptly dispatched a formidable fleet to aid that city. Besides them, the Chians, Coans, Rhodians, and some others of the Greeks sent reinforcements also. Philip was frightened by this joint action, broke off the siege of the two cities, and made a treaty of peace with the Athenians and the other Greeks who opposed him. In the west, the Carthaginians prepared great stores of war materials and transported their forces to Sicily. They had all told, including the forces previously on the island, more than 70,000 infantry, cavalry, war chariots, and extra teams of horses, amounting to not less than 10,200 battleships, and more than 1,000 freighters carrying the horses, weapons, food, and everything else. Timoleon was not daunted, however, although he learned the size of the hostile force while he himself was reduced to a handful of soldiers. He was still at war with Hicetas, but came to terms with him and took over his troops, thus materially increasing his own army. He decided to commence the struggle with the Carthaginians in their own territory so as to keep intact the land of his allies while wasting that which was subject at barbarian. He assembled his mercenaries immediately, together with the Syracusans and his allies, called a general assembly, and encouraged his audience with appropriate words to face the decisive struggle. When all applauded and shouted, urging him to lead them immediately against the barbarians, he took the field with not more than 12,000 men in all. He had reached the territory of Agrigentum when unexpected confusion and discord broke out in his army. One of his mercenaries, named Thracius, who had been with the Phocians when they plundered the shrine at Delphi and was remarkable for his mad recklessness, now perpetrated an act that matched his former outrages. While almost all the rest who had participated in the sacrilege against the oracle had received from the deity their due punishment, as we reported a little earlier, he who alone had eluded divine vengeance attempted to incite the mercenaries to desert. He said that Timoleon was out of his mind and was leading his men to certain destruction. The Carthaginians were 6 times their number and were immeasurably superior in every sort of equipment, but Timoleon was nevertheless promising that they would win, gambling with the lives of the mercenaries, whom for a long time, because of lack of funds, he had not even been able to pay. Thracius recommended that they should return to Syracuse and demand their pay, and not follow Timoleon any further on a hopeless campaign. The mercenaries received his speech with enthusiasm and were on the point of mutiny, but Timoleon with some difficulty quieted the disturbance by urgent pleading and the offer of gifts. Even so, 1,000 men did go off with Thracius, but he put off their punishment till a later time, and by writing to his friends in Syracuse to receive them kindly and to pay them their arrears, he brought the unrest to an end, but also stripped the disobedient men of all credit for the victory. With the rest, whose loyalty he had regained by tactful handling, he marched against the enemy who were encamped not far away. Calling an assembly of the troops, he encouraged them with an address, describing the cowardice of the Phoenicians and recalling the success of Jalon. Just at the moment when all, as with one voice, were clamoring to attack the barbarians and to begin the battle, it chanced that pack animals came carrying wild celery for their bedding, and Timoleon declared that he accepted the omen of his victory, for the crown at the Isthmian Games is woven of this. On his suggestion, the soldiers plaited crowns out of celery and with their heads wreathed advanced cheerfully in the confidence that the god foretold their victory. And that, as a matter of fact, is how it was, for unpredictably, incredible to tell, they got the better of the enemy not only through their own valor, but also through the god's specific assistance. Timoleon deployed his forces and advanced down from a line of little hills to the river Crimisus, where 10,000 of the enemy had already crossed. These he shattered at the first outset, taking his own position in the center of his line. There was a sharp fight, but as the Greeks were superior both in bravery and in skill, there was great slaughter of the barbarians. The rest began to flee, but the main body of the Carthaginians crossed the river in the meantime and restored the situation. As the battle was renewed, the Phoenicians were overwhelming the Greeks with their superior numbers when, suddenly, from the heavens sheets of rain broke in a storm of great hailstones, while lightning flashed and thunder roared and the wind blew in fierce gusts. All of this tempest buffeted the backs of the Greeks, but struck the faces of the barbarians, so that, though Timoleon's soldiers were not much inconvenienced by the affair, the Phoenicians could not stand the force of circumstances, and as the Greeks continued to attack them, they broke into flight. As all sought the river together, horse and foot intermingled, while the chariots added to the confusion, some perished helplessly trodden underfoot or pierced by the swords or lances of their comrades, while others were herded by Timoleon's cavalry into the bed of the river and were struck down from behind. Many died without an enemy stroke as the bodies piled up in the panic. There was crowding, and it was difficult to keep one's feet in the stream. Worst of all, as the rain came down heavily, the river swept downstream as a raging torrent and carried the men with it, drowning them as they struggled to swim in their heavy armor. In the end, even the Carthaginians who composed the sacred battalion, 2,500 in number and drawn from the ranks of those citizens who were distinguished for valor and reputation as well as for wealth, were all cut down after a gallant struggle. In the other elements of their army, more than 10,000 soldiers were killed and no less than 15,000 were taken captive. Most of the chariots were destroyed in the battle, but 200 were taken. The baggage train, with the draft animals and most of the wagons, fell into the hands of the Greeks. Most of the armor was lost in the river, but 1,000 breastplates and more than 10,000 shields were brought to the tent of Timoleon. Of these, some were dedicated later in the temples at Syracuse, some were distributed among the allies, and some were sent home by Timoleon to Corinth with instructions to dedicate them in the temple of Poseidon. The battle yielded a great store of wealth also, because the Carthaginians had with them an abundance of silver and gold drinking vessels. These, as well as the rest of the personal property, which was very numerous because of the wealth of the Carthaginians, Timoleon allowed the soldiers to keep as rewards for their gallantry. But for their part, the Carthaginians who escaped from the battle made their way with difficulty to safety at Lilybaeum. Such consternation and terror possessed them that they did not dare embark in their ships and sail to Libya, persuaded that they would be swallowed up by the Libyan Sea because their gods had forsaken them. In Carthage itself, when news of the extent of the disaster had come, all were crushed in spirit and took it for granted that Timoleon would come against them directly with his army. They wasted no time in recalling from exile Gisco, the son of Hanno, and appointing him general, for they thought that he best combined the qualities of boldness and military skill. They voted not to risk the lives of citizens in the future, but to enlist foreign mercenaries, especially Greeks, who, they thought, would answer the call in large numbers because of the high rate of pay and the wealth of Carthage. And they sent skilled envoys to Sicily with instructions to make peace on whatever terms proved possible. At the end of this year, Lysimacheides became archon at Athens, and in Rome they were elected as consuls Quintus Servilius and Marcus Rutilius. In this year, Timoleon returned to Syracuse and promptly expelled from the city as traitors all the mercenaries who had abandoned him under the leadership of Thracius. These crossed over into Italy and, coming upon a coastal town in Bruttium, sacked it. The Bruttians, incensed, immediately marched against them with a large army, stormed the place, and shot them all down with javelin. Those who had abandoned Timoleon were rewarded by such misfortune for their own wickedness. Timoleon himself seized and put to death Postumius the Etruscan, who had been raiding sea traffic with 12 corsairs and had put in at Syracuse as a friendly city. He received the new settlers sent out by the Corinthians kindly, to the number of 5,000. Then, when the Carthaginians sent envoys and pleaded with them urgently, he granted them peace on the terms that all the Greek cities should be free, that the river Lycus should be the boundary of their respective territory, and that the Carthaginians might not give aid to the tyrants who were at war with Syracuse. After this, he concluded his war with Hisatas and put him to death, and then attacked the Campanians in Aetna and wiped them out. Likewise, he overbore Nicodemus, tyrant of Centuripe, and ousted him from that city, and putting an end to the tyranny of Apolloniades in Egerium, he gave Syracusan citizenship to its freed inhabitants. In a word, all of the tyrants throughout the island were uprooted, and the cities were set free and taken into his alliance. He made proclamation in Greece that the Syracusans would give land and houses to those who wished to come and share in their state, and many Greeks came to receive their allotments. Ultimately, 40,000 settlers were assigned to the vacant land of Syracuse and 10,000 to that of Egerium because of its extent and quality. At this time, also, Timoleon revised the existing laws of Syracuse, which Diocles had composed. Those concerning private contracts and inheritance he allowed to remain unaltered, but he amended those concerned with public affairs in whatever way seemed advantageous to his own concept. Chairman and director of this legislative program was Cephalus the Corinthian, a man distinguished for education and intelligence. When his hands were free of this matter, Timoleon transferred the people of Leontini to Syracuse, but sent additional settlers to Camarina and enlarged the city. So, having established peaceful conditions everywhere throughout Sicily, he caused the cities to experience a vast growth of prosperity. For many years, because of domestic troubles and border wars, and still more because of the numbers of tyrants who kept constantly appearing, the cities had become destitute of inhabitants, and the open country had become a wilderness for lack of cultivation, producing no useful crops. But now new settlers streamed into the land in great numbers, and as a long period of peace set in, the fields were reclaimed for cultivation and bore abundant crops of all sorts. These, the Siciliate Greeks sold to merchants at good prices and rapidly increased their wealth. It was by reason of the funds so acquired that many large constructions were completed in that period. There was, first, the structure in Syracuse on the island called the Hall of the 60 Couches, which surpassed all the other buildings of Sicily in size and grandeur. This was built by Agathocles the despot, and since, in its pretentiousness, it went beyond the temples of the gods, so it received a mark of heaven's displeasure in being struck by lightning. Then there were the towers along the shore of the little harbour with their mosaic inscriptions of varicolored stones, proclaiming the name of their founder, Agathocles. Comparable to these, but a little later, in the time of Hiero the king, there was built the Olympiaeum in the market and the altar beside the theatre, a stayed in length and proportionally high and broad. Among the lesser cities is to be reckoned Agerium, but since it shared in the increase of settlers due to this agricultural prosperity, it built the finest theatre in Sicily after that of Syracuse, together with temples of the gods, a council chamber, and a market. There were also memorable towers, as well as pyramidal monuments of architectural distinction marking graves, many and great. When Charondes was archon at Athens, Lucius Aemilius and Gaius Plautius succeeded to the consulship. In this year, Philip the king, having won most of the Greeks over to friendship with him, was ambitious to gain the uncontested leadership of Greece by terrifying the Athenians into submission. Therefore, he suddenly seized the city of Elatea, concentrated his forces there, and adopted a policy of war with Athens. He expected to have no trouble in defeating them, since their reliance on the existing peace treaty made them unprepared for hostilities, and that is how it worked out. For after Elatea had been occupied, persons came at night to Athens reporting the occupation and stating that Philip would march immediately into Attica with his army. Taken aback by this unexpected development, the Athenian generals summoned the trumpeters and ordered them to keep blowing the alarm signal the whole night through. The news spread into every household, and the city was tense with terror, and at dawn the whole people flocked to the theatre, even before the archons had made their customary proclamation. When the generals came and introduced the messenger, and he had told his story, silence and terror gripped the assembly, and none of the usual speakers dared propose a course of action. Again and again the herald called for someone to speak for the common safety, but no one came forward with a proposal. In utter perplexity and dismay, the crowd kept their eyes on Demosthenes. Finally, he came down from his seat, and bidding the people take heart, gave it as his opinion that they must straightway send envoys to Thebes and invite the Boeotians to join them to make a struggle for freedom. There was no time to send envoys to their other allies invoking the treaties of alliance, since in 2 days the king could be expected to enter Attica. As his way led through Boeotia, the support of the Boeotians was their only recourse, especially since Philip was at that time the friend and ally of the Boeotians, and would evidently try to take them along as he marched past to the war against Athens. When the people accepted the proposal and the decree authorizing the embassy had been drafted by Demosthenes, they turned to the search for their most eloquent representative. Demosthenes willingly answered the call to service. He carried out the mission vigorously and returned to Athens at last, having secured the adhesion of the Thebans. Now that they had doubled their existing armed forces by the foreign alliance, the Athenians recovered their confidence. At once, they designated Chaws and Lysicles as generals and sent forth their entire army under arms into Boeotia. All their youth reported eager for battle and advanced with forced marches as far as Charonaea in Boeotia. Impressed by the promptness of the Athenian arrival, and themselves no less ready to act decisively, the Boeotians joined them with their weapons and, brigaded together, all awaited the approach of the enemy. Philip's first move was to send envoys to the Boeotian League, the most eminent of whom was Pytho. He was celebrated for his eloquence, but judged by the Boeotians in this contest for their allegiance against Demosthenes, he surpassed all the other speakers, to be sure, but was clearly inferior to him. And Demosthenes himself in his speeches parades his success against this orator as a great accomplishment, where he says, "I did not then give ground before Pytho in spite of his confidence and his torrent of words against you." So Philip failed to get the support of the Boeotians, but nevertheless decided to fight both of the allies together. He waited for the last of his laggard confederates to arrive and then marched into Boeotia. His forces came to more than 30,000 infantry and no less than 2,000 cavalry. Both sides were on the edge for the battle, high-spirited and eager, and were well matched in courage, but the king had the advantage in numbers and in generalship. He had fought many battles of different sorts and had been victorious in most cases, so that he had a wide experience in military operation. On the Athenian side, the best of their generals were dead, Iphicrates, Chabrias, and Timotheus too, and the best of those who were left, Geer, was no better than any average soldier in the energy and discretion required of a commander. The armies deployed at dawn, and the king stationed his son Alexander, young in age but noted for his valor and swiftness of action, on one wing, placing beside him his most seasoned generals, while he himself, at the head of picked men, exercised the command over the other. Individual units were stationed where the occasion required. On the other side, dividing the line according to nationality, the Athenians assigned one wing to the Boeotians and kept command of the other themselves. Once joined, the battle was hotly contested for a long time, and many fell on both sides, so that for a while the struggle permitted hopes of victory to both. Then Alexander, his heart set on showing his father his prowess and yielding to none in will to win, ably seconded by his men, first succeeded in rupturing the solid front of the enemy line and striking down many he bore heavily on the troops opposite him. As the same success was won by his companions, gaps in the front were constantly opened. Corpses piled up until finally Alexander forced his way through the line and put his opponents to flight. Then the king also in person advanced, well in front and not conceding credit for the victory, even to Alexander. He first forced back the troops stationed before him, and then, by compelling them to flee, became the man responsible for the victory. More than 1,000 Athenians fell in the battle, and no less than 2,000 were captured. Likewise, many of the Boeotians were killed and not a few taken prisoners. After the battle, Philip raised a trophy of victory, yielded the dead for burial, gave sacrifices to the gods for victory, and rewarded, according to their deserts, those of his men who had distinguished themselves. The story is told that in the drinking, after dinner, Philip downed a large amount of unmixed wine, and forming with his friends a commerce in celebration of the victory paraded through the midst of his captives, jeering all the time at the misfortunes of the luckless men. Now Demades, the orator, who was then one of the captives, spoke out boldly and made a remark able to curb the king's disgusting exhibition. He is said to have remarked, "O king, when fortune has cast you in the role of Agamemnon, are you not ashamed to act the part of their sights?" Stung by this well-aimed shaft of rebuke, Philip altered his whole demeanor completely. He cast off his garland, brushed aside the symbols of pride that marked the commerce, expressed admiration for the man who dared to speak so plainly, freed him from captivity, and gave him a place in his own company with every mark of honor. Addressed by Demades with Attic charm, he ended by releasing all of the Athenian prisoners without ransom and, altogether abandoning the arrogance of victory, sent envoys to the people of Athens and concluded with them a treaty of friendship and alliance. With the Boeotians, Heo concluded peace but maintained a garrison in Thebes. After this defeat, the Athenians condemned to death the general Lycicles on the accusation of Lycurgus, the orator. Lycurgus had the highest repute of the politicians of his time, and since he had won praise for his conduct of the city's finances over a period of 12 years and lived in general a life renowned for rectitude, he proved to be a very stern prosecutor. One can judge of his character and austerity in the passage in his accusation where he says, "You were General Lysical. 1,000 citizens have perished, and 2,000 were taken captive. A trophy stands over your city's defeat, and all of Greece is enslaved. All of this happened under your leadership and command, and yet you dare to live and to look on the sun and even to intrude into the market, a living monument of our country's shame, and disgrace. There was an odd coincidence in the period under review. At the same time as the battle took place at Chaeronea, another battle occurred in Italy on the same day and at the same hour between the people of Tarentum and the Lucanians. In the service of Tarentum was Archidamus, the Lacedaemonian king, and it happened that he was himself killed. He had ruled the Lacedaemonians for 23 years. His son Agis succeeded to the throne and ruled for 9 years. At this time, also, Timotheus, the tyrant of Heraclea Pontica, died after having been in power for 15 years. His brother Dionysius succeeded to the tyranny and ruled for 32 years. When Phrynichus was archon at Athens, the Romans installed as consuls Titus Manlius Torquatus and Publius Decius. In this year, King Philip, proudly conscious of his victory at Chaeronea, and seeing that he had dashed the confidence of the leading Greek cities, conceived of the ambition to become the leader of all Greece. He spread the word that he wanted to make war on the Persians in the Greeks' behalf, and to punish them for the profanation of the temples, and this won for him the loyal support of the Greeks. He showed a kindly face to all, in private and in public, and he represented to the cities that he wished to discuss with them matters of common advantage. A general congress was, accordingly, convened at Corinth. He spoke about the war against Persia, and by raising great expectations won the representatives over to war. The Greeks elected him the general plenipotentiary of Greece, and he began accumulating supplies for the campaign. He prescribed the number of soldiers that each city should send for the joint effort, and then return to Macedonia. This was the state of affairs as regards Philip. In Sicily, Timoleon the Corinthian died. He had put in order all the affairs of the Syracusans and the other Siciliate Greeks, and had been their general for 8 years. The Syracusans revered him greatly because of his ability and the extent of his services to them, and gave him a magnificent funeral. As the body was borne out in the presence of all the people, the following decree was proclaimed by that Demetrius, who had the most powerful voice of all the criers of his time. The people of Syracuse have voted to bury this Timoleon son of Timianetus of Corinth at a cost of 200 minae, and to honor him to the end of time with musical, equestrian, and gymnastic games, because he destroyed the tyrants, defeated the barbarians, and resettled the mightiest of Greek cities, and so became the author of freedom for the Greeks of Sicily. In this year, also, Ariobarzanes died after ruling for 26 years, and Mithridates, succeeding him, ruled for 35. The Romans were victorious in a battle against the Latins in Campanians in the vicinity of Suessa, and annexed part of the territory of the vanquished. Manlius, the consul who had won the victory, celebrated a triumph. When Pythodorus was archon at Athens, the Romans elected as consuls Quintus Publius and Tiberius Aemilius Mamercus, and the 111th celebration of the Olympic Games took place, in which Cleomantis of Cleta won the foot race. In this year, King Philip, installed as leader by the Greeks, opened the war with Persia by sending into Asia as an advance party Attalus and Parmenion, assigning to them a part of his forces and ordering them to liberate the Greek cities, while he himself, wanting to enter upon the war with the gods' approval, asked the Pythia whether he would conquer the king of the Persian. She gave him the following response: "Wreathed is the bull. All is done. There is also the one who will smite him." Now Philip found this response ambiguous, but accepted it in a sense favorable to himself, namely that the oracle foretold that the Persian would be slaughtered like a sacrificial victim. Actually, however, it was not so, and it meant that Philip himself, in the midst of a festival and holy sacrifices like the bull, would be stabbed to death while decked with a garland. In any event, he thought that the gods supported him, and was very happy to think that Asia would be made captive under the hands of the Macedonians. Straight away, he set in motion plans for gorgeous sacrifices to the gods, joined with the wedding of his daughter Cleopatra, whose mother was Olympias. He had given her in marriage to Alexander, king of Epirus, Olympia's own brother. He wanted as many Greeks as possible to take part in the festivities in honor of the gods, and so planned brilliant musical contests and lavish banquets for his friends and guests. Out of all Greece, he summoned his personal guest friends, and ordered the members of his court to bring along as many as they could of their acquaintances from abroad. He was determined to show himself to the Greeks as an amiable person, and to respond to the honors conferred when he was appointed to the supreme command with appropriate entertainment. So great numbers of people flocked together from all directions to the festival, and the games and the marriage were celebrated in Aegae in Macedonia. Not only did individual notables crown him with golden crowns, but most of the important cities as well, and among them Athens. As this award was being announced by the herald, he ended with the declaration that if anyone plotted against King Philip and fled to Athens for refuge, he would be delivered up. The casual phrase seemed like an omen sent by Providence to let Philip know that a plot was coming. There were other like words also spoken, seemingly divinely inspired, which forecast the king's death. At the state banquet, Philip ordered the actor Neoptolemus, matchless in the power of his voice and in his popularity, to present some well-received pieces, particularly such as bore on the Persian campaign. The artist thought that his piece would be taken as appropriate to Philip's crossing and intended to rebuke the wealth of the Persian king, great and famous as it was, suggesting that it could someday be overturned by fortune. Here are the words that he first sang. Your thoughts reach higher than the air. You dream of wide fields cultivation. The homes you plan surpass the homes that men have known, but you do err, guiding your life afar. But one there is who'll catch the swift, who goes away obscured in gloom, and sudden, unseen, overtakes and robs us of our distant hopes. Death, mortal's source of many woes. He continued with the rest of the song, all of it dealing with the same theme. Philip was enchanted with the message and was completely occupied with the thought of the overthrow of the Persian king, for he remembered the Pythian oracle, which bore the same meaning as the words quoted by the tragic actor. Finally, the drinking was over, and the start of the game set for the following day. While it was still dark, the multitude of spectators hastened into the theatre, and at sunrise the parade formed. Along with lavish display of every sort, Philip included in the procession statues of the 12 gods, wrought with great artistry and adorned with a dazzling show of wealth to strike awe in the beholder. And along with these was conducted a 13th statue, suitable for a god, that of Philip himself, so that the king exhibited himself enthroned among the 12 gods. Every seat in the theatre was taken when Philip appeared wearing a white cloak, and by his express orders his bodyguard held away from him and followed only at a distance, since he wanted to show publicly that he was protected by the goodwill of all the Greeks, and had no need of a guard of spearmen. Such was the pinnacle of success that he had attained, but as the praises and congratulations of all rang in his ears, suddenly without warning the plot against the king was revealed as death-struck. We shall set forth the reasons for this, in order that our story may be clear. There was a Macedonian Pausanias who came of a family from the district Orestis. He was a bodyguard of the king and was beloved of him because of his beauty. When he saw that the king was becoming enamored of another Pausanias, a man of the same name as himself, he addressed him with abusive language, accusing him of being a hermaphrodite and prompt to accept the amorous advances of any who wished. Unable to endure such an insult, the other kept silent for the time, but after confiding to Attalus, one of his friends, what he proposed to do, he brought about his own death voluntarily and in a spectacular fashion. For a few days after this, as Philip was engaged in battle with Ploreas, king of the Illyrians, Pausanias stepped in front of him and, receiving on his body all the blows directed at the king, so met his death. The incident was widely discussed, and Attalus, who was a member of the court circle and influential with the king, invited the first Pausanias to dinner, and when he had plied him till drunk with unmixed wine, handed his unconscious body over to the muleteers to abuse in drunken licentiousness. So he presently recovered from his drunken stupor, and deeply resenting the outrage to his person, charged Attalus before the king with the outrage. Philip shared his anger at the barbarity of the act, but did not wish to punish Attalus at that time because of their relationship, and because Attalus's services were needed urgently. He was the nephew of the Cleopatra, whom the king had just married as a new wife, and he had been selected as a general of the advanced force being sent into Asia, for he was a man valiant in battle. For these reasons, the king tried to mollify the righteous anger of Pausanias at his treatment, giving him substantial presents and advancing him in honor among his bodyguards. Pausanias, nevertheless, nursed his wrath implacably and yearned to avenge himself not only on the one who had done him wrong, but also on the one who failed to avenge him. In this design, he was encouraged especially by the sophist Hermocrates. He was his pupil, and when he asked in the course of his instruction how one might become most famous, The sophist replied that it would be by killing the one who had accomplished most, for just as long as he was remembered, so long his slayer would be remembered also. Pausanias connected this saying with his private resentment, and admitting no delay in his plans because of his grievance, he determined to act under cover of the festival in the following manner. He posted horses at the gates of the city and came to the entrance of the theatre carrying a Celtic dagger under his cloak. When Philip directed his attending friends to precede him into the theatre, while the guards kept their distance, he saw that the king was left alone, rushed at him, pierced him through his ribs, and stretched him out dead, then ran for the gates and the horses which he had prepared for his flight. Immediately, one group of the bodyguards hurried to the body of the king, while the rest poured out in pursuit of the assassin. Among these last were Leonatus and Perdiccas and Attalus. Having a good start, Pausanias would have mounted his horse before they could catch him, had he not caught his boot in a vine and fallen. As he was scrambling to his feet, Perdiccas and the rest came up with him and killed him with their javelins. Such was the end of Philip, who had made himself the greatest of the kings in Europe in his time, and because of the extent of his kingdom had made himself a throned companion of the 12 gods. He had ruled 24 years. He is known to fame as one who, with but the slenderest resources to support his claim to a throne, won for himself the greatest empire in the Greek world, while the growth of his position was not due so much to his prowess in arms as to his adroitness and cordiality in diplomacy. Philip himself is said to have been prouder of his grasp of strategy and his diplomatic successes than of his valor in actual battle. Every member of his army shared in the successes which were won in the field, but he alone got credit for victories won through negotiation. Now that we have come to the death of Philip, we shall conclude this book here, according to our original statement. Beginning the next one with Alexander's accession as king, we shall try to include all of his career in one book. The Lorb editor's notes: 1 Eubulus was Archon from July 345 to June 344 BCE. Broughton 1.131 gives the consuls of 345 BCE as M. Abius Dorsur and Servius Dorsua and Servius Sulpicius Camerinus Rufus. 2. The narrative is continued from chap. 65. There is a parallel but often differing account of these events in Plutarch, Timoleon, wherein 7.13, 8.3, 8.3, the 10 ships are itemized as 7 Corinthian, 1 Leucadian, and 2 Choerean. This distinction between triremes and fast-sailing ships is artificial. 3 Plutarch, Timoleon, 8.1. 4 Plutarch, Timoleon, 8.1, states that this dedication was made by Corinthians before the departure of the flotilla. 5 This anticipates the action described in chap. 68, but according to Plutarch's account, Timoleon, 7.3, 9.2, Hystaspes had become an ally of the Carthaginians even before Timoleon left Corinth. 6. The charioteer receipts of P. Petri, 2.25, dated in the 21st year of Ptolemy Philadelphus, 265 4 BCE, show that it was customary for chariots to be accompanied by spare horses trained to work in pairs. This account of Carthaginian operations is not given by Plutarch. 7 Plutarch, Timoleon, 1.3. 8 Plutarch, Timoleon, 9.2. 9 The same story is told by Plutarch, Timoleon, 9.2, 10.5. 10 This was the father of the historian Timaeus, who may have been tyrant of the city, although Plutarch also, Timoleon, 10.4, describes his position by the same non-technical term as is used here. 11 Plutarch, Timoleon, 12.35, give us the same figures for Hystaspes' casualties, but states that Timoleon had no more than 1,200 men, and adds that one faction in Adranum had invited him. It is possible that Timoleon's success in the surprise attack was due in part to the circumstance that Hecates was fooled because he still regarded Timoleon as an ally leech. D. Westlake, Timoleon and his relations with tyrants, 1952, 15f. Plutarch gives the road distance between Tauromenium and Adranum as 340 furlong. 12 According to Plutarch, Timoleon, 13.23, Timoleon got his first foothold in Syracuse only when Dionysius voluntarily surrendered his holdings to him. 13 Lyciscus was Archon at Athens from July 344 to June 343 BC. The Olympic Games were celebrated in midsummer of 344 BC. Valerius Corvus and M. Popilius Laenas were consuls in 348 BC. Walton 1.129.14. This treaty is mentioned also by Livy 7.272 and Polybius 3.24. Diodorus does not know of the earlier treaty given by Polybius 3.22 CP. H. M. Last, Cambridge Ancient History 7, 1928, 859 F. Aimard, Revue des Études Anciennes 59, 1957, 277, 293. 15 continued from chap. 45.7. 16 Plutarch, Timoleon 17.2, gives the same number of ships, but 60,000 men. Tyndaris was a city on the north coast of Sicily, 30 miles from Tauromenium. 17 Plutarch, Timoleon 13.1, and elsewhere calls him Mamercus, and Diodorus's name may be due to a scribal error. On the other hand, as an Italian, Mamercus may well have borne the praenomen Marcus. 18 according to Plutarch, Timoleon 16.12, the Corinthians sent 2,000 hoplites and 200 cavalry to Thurii, but the force made its way to Sicily only somewhat later. T. Mulean 19. 19 Plutarch, Timoleon 20 tells a different and more circumstantial and picturesque account of the Carthaginian withdrawal. 20 Plutarch, Timoleon 21.3. 21 Plutarch, Timoleon 20.1 places this event earlier. 22 This campaign may be the one referred to below chap. 93.6. The narrative of Philip's activities continued from chap. 60. 23 This operation continued earlier movements of Philip and Cecily. Chaps 35.1, 38.1, 52.9. For Philip's relations with the tyrants of Ferry Keep. H.D. Westlake, Thessaly, in the 4th century BCE, 1935, 191, 193. Marta Sordi, La Lega Tessala fino Ado Alessandro Magno 1958, 275, 293. 24. Pythodotus was archon at Athens from July 343 to June 342 BCE. P2 BCE. Plautius Veno and T. Manlius Imperiosus Torquatus were the consuls of 347 BC. Broughton 1.130. 25. Plutarch, Timoleon 13.25. 26. This was an oft-quoted metaphor credited to the elder Dionysius. Keep. Above chap. 5.4. Plutarch, Dion 7.3 and 10.3. 27. The same figure in chap. 9.2. Plutarch, Dion 14. 2. Nepos, Dion 5.3 mentions 500. 28. This term is traceable to Theopompus, Polybius 12.42, Jacobi, Fragmente der Griechischen Historiker, no. 115 f. 341, where Timaeus used Norse. 29 Plutarch, Timoleon 22.12, Nepos, Timoleon 3.3. 30 This priesthood is not mentioned by Plutarch and may be a personal observation of Diodorus himself. 31 This humbling of the Amphipolate probably consisted in making it no longer eponymous. Instead of a local priesthood, the Syracusans thereafter dated by the Roman consul. The reference may be to the grant of jus latii to the Sicilians by Caesar by 44 BCE, Cicero ad Atticum 14.12.1, or to later grants by Augustus A. N. Sherman White, the Roman citizenship 1939, 175. 32 continued from chap. 69. Justin's account 9.1. One of these operations is drawn from a source hostile to Philip. 33 Similar references to literary figures are a recurring feature of Diodorus's narrative. A. Schwartz, Real Encyclopédie 5, 1905, 668 f. E. Keep. Also chap. 76.56 below. These are usually, although not always, historians, and we must suppose that Diodorus was familiar with their writing. To what extent they are to be taken as his specific sources is unknown. Diodorus referred to the beginning of Theopompus's Philippica above, chap. 3.8. 34 Sosigenes was archon at Athens from July 342 to June 341 BCE. The consuls of 346 BCE were M. Valerius Corvus and C. Poetelius Libo Vizcelos Broughton, 1.131. 35. His accession is not mentioned by Diodorus under the year 351, 0 BCE. Alexander's accession is otherwise known from Demosthenes, 7.32. 36. Continued from chap. 70. Keep. Plutarch Timoleon, 24.12. 37. Probably the Leptines mentioned in chap. 45.9, and probably the nephew of the elder Dionysius, T. Lenschow, Real Encyclopédie, 12, 1925, 2073. 38. Plutarch Timoleon, 24.4, 25.2. 39. Plutarch Timoleon, 25.1. 40. Plutarch Timoleon, 27.3. 41. Plutarch Timoleon, 28.6, mentions Libyans, Iberians, and Numidians. 42. Nicomachus was archon at Athens from July 341 to June 340 BC. The consuls of 344 BCE were consuls of 344 BC, Marcius Rutulius and T. Manlius Imperiosus Tocratus, Broughton, 1.132. Or 43 above, chap. 69.2. 44. These events in Philip's career are barely noticed by Justin, 9.125, and only casual references to them occur elsewhere. 45. The sieges were given under the year 340-39 BCE by Philochorus, Jacobi, Fragmente der Griechischen Historiker, no. 328-54. They may well have extended over more than one arching year. 46. Diodorus nowhere mentions the beginning of Epirus's history, perhaps because it began as far back as his own. In chap. 14.3, he referred to its continuation by his son Demophilus. According to Clement of Alexandria, Stromateus, 1.139, 4, Epirus reckons 735 years between the return of the Heraclida and the archonship of Evernitus, 335, 4 BCE. On that basis, B. 10 Brink, Philologus 6, 1851, 589, suggested correcting 50 here to 30. 47. His history was referred to above, chap. 14.5. 48. That is, Philip the son of Cassander, who died in 297 6 BCE. 49. Theophrastus was archon at Athens from July 340 to June 339 BCE. The Olympic Games were celebrated in midsummer of 340 BCE. Rawton, 1.132, lists the consul of 343 BCE as a Malay. 50. This account of Diodorus differs from the presumably correct one given elsewhere, going back over Philochorus to Theopompus, in Didymus, Jacobi, Fragmente der Griechischen Historica, no. 115 of 292. Byzantium was assisted by Chios, Kos, and Rhodes, her old allies in the social war, as well as by the Persian. The Athenian fleet under Chares arrived only to ensure the safe passage of the grain fleet from the Black Sea. Philip's capture of this fleet was a major factor in Athens' decision to abrogate the peace treaty. The result was war, not peace. Cheap. Demosthenes, 18, De Corona, 87, 94, Plutarch, Phocion, 14, 51, continued from chap. 73. C. Plutarch, Timoleon, 25.1, gives the same figures, but fails to mention the cavalry and the chariots. 52. Plutarch does not mention the support furnished Timoleon by Hystas at this time. 53. Plutarch, Timoleon, 25.23, states that there were 3,000 Syracusans and 4,000 mercenaries, of whom 1,000 deserted before the battle. The remainder were 5,000 foot and 1,000 horse. 54. Chap. 58.6. 55. Plutarch Timoleon, 25.34. 56, that is, at the Battle of Himera, 480 BCE, Polybius reproaches Timaeus for this, placing in the mouth of Timoleon derogatory remarks concerning the Carthaginians, but not advancing proof that Timoleon did not actually speak in this way. 12.26a. Jacobi, Fragmente der Griechischen Historiker, No. 566 f31. 57. This was the Apium graveolens, which is also frequently called parsley. It is fragrant, seep. Org, Real Encyclopédie, 6, 1909, 255 f. E. This anecdote was told by Timaeus, Jacobi, Fragmente der Griechischen Historiker, No. 566 f. 118, and appears in Plutarch, Timoleon 26. Thayer's note, the species identification isn't as clear as it could be. Apium graveolens is the Linnaean name for any celery. The plant, commonly called wild celery, is a subspecies, Apium graveolens dulcmil. Because of its distinctive taste, it too, despite its name, is occasionally cultivated. Rich, well-watered soils suit it best, as for example the fertile plain, almost marshland, below Trevi in Umbria, where it is called Sedano Nero, or black celery. The town celebrates a lively, well-attended annual black celery festival. 58. The river is variously spelled Chrymesus, Plutarch, Timoleon 25.60, and Chrymissus, Nepos, Timoleon 2.4. 59. The story of the battle is told more circumstantially in Plutarch, Timoleon 27:29. The time was just before the summer solstice of 339 BC. Plutarch, Timoleon 27.1. 60. This unit is mentioned again by Diodorus in another connection, Book 20.106. 61. Plutarch, Timoleon 28.56 gives the number of dead as 10,000, including 3,000 Carthaginians. 62. Plutarch, Timoleon 29. 63. Plutarch, Timoleon 30.1 states only that Timoleon allowed his mercenaries to plunder the territory of the Carthaginians, CPP chap 73.1. 64. Plutarch, Timoleon 30.3. 65. Plutarch, Timoleon 30.3. 66. Lysimacheides was archon at Athens from July 339 to June 338 BCE. The consuls of 342 BCE were Q. Servilius Ahala and C. Marcius Rutulus, Broughton 1.133. 67. Plutarch, Timoleon 30.12. Another group of the impious mercenaries is mentioned also in 30.4. 68. This story does not appear in Plutarch. 69. Freedom in Greek political terminology did not exclude the possibility of an overlord Carthage or Syracuse. Plutarch, Timoleon 34.1, does not mention this feature of the treaty. 70. Diodorus usually calls this river Halicus, books 15.175, 23.95, 24.18. 71. Plutarch, Timoleon 31.2, 32. Since Timoleon had just accepted the aid of Hesetas against the Carthaginians chap 77.5, this change of policy suggests some duplicity on his part. Westlake, Timoleon and his relations with tyrants, 15 feet. 72. This is not mentioned by Plutarch. 73. This was Diodorus's own native city. 74. Plutarch, Timoleon 22.35, 23, where the invitation was issued when Timoleon first became master of Syracuse. 35. According to the historian Athanas, quoted by Plutarch, Timoleon 23.4, O Jacobi Fragm. Der Greer, Hist. No. 562, F2, Dev2, they 50,000 who came. T. Further Book 19.28. 75, CP. Book 13.33 and 35. 76. Nepos, Timoleon 3.12. These observations are probably Diodorus's own, based on his personal experience and knowledge. Note the reference to his city, Egerium in chap 83.3. Kokalos 4, 1958, is devoted exclusively to articles concerned with the effect of Timoleon on Sicily. 77. This was a great banqueting hall. Keep. The tent of 100 couches employed by Alexander the Great, Book 17.16.4. 78. These monuments are mentioned by Cicero in Verum 2.453. 79. Charondes was archon at Athens from July 338 to June 337 BCE. The consuls of 341 BCE were L. Aemilius Mamercinus Praevinus and C. Plautius Veneno, Broughton 1.134. 80. Continued from chap. 77.3. These events are briefly noted in Justin 9.3. 81. This is consistent with Diodorus's statement in chap. 77.3 that peace was concluded on the abandonment of the siege of Byzantium. Actually, the situation seems to have been just the reverse. Athens denounced the peace of Philocrates at that time. 82. This narrative follows and must ultimately derive from Demosthenes 18 de Corona 169, 178. 83. These are listed by Demosthenes de Corona 237 as Euboea, Achaia, Corinth, Megara, Lucus, and Corcyra. Aeschines, in Ctesiphontim 97, mentions Acarnania also. 84. The famous orator, a native of Byzantium, had long been in the service of Philip. Strabo 9.237 states that the Corinthians also sent troops. 85. Demosthenes de Corona 136 refers to an early encounter between the two which took place in Athens in 343 BCE. Also, de Helloneso 20. 86. Diodorus writes disparagingly of chairs, also in Book 15.95. 3. Here, he has much compressed the narrative since 10 or 11 months elapsed between the occupation of Elatea and the Battle of Cheronea. 87. According to Plutarch, Camillus 19.5, this was the 9th of Metagitnion, the second month of the Attic year, which began after the summer solstice. So perhaps 4th August, since a new moon was visible at Athens on 27th July. 88. Diodorus's account of the battle is vague, and much is uncertain in the reconstruction of events from scattered and partial references. It seems certain that Philip, on the Macedonian right, did not engage the Athenians until the Thebans, on the allied right, had been shattered by Alexander. Since, in his later battles, Alexander normally commanded the cavalry guard on his own right, Philip here must have occupied the traditional position of the Macedonian king. But Diodorus does not say who these picked men were. 89. Plutarch, Demosthenes 20.3 tells of Philip's reveling and reciting the beginning of the decree introduced by his rival as if it were verse. Demosthenes, the son of Demosthenes, Paeanion, thus proposeth. Justin 9.51, in contrast, speaks of Philip as bearing his victory modestly. Keep. Also Plutarch, Moralia 715. C. Addenda 90. Philostratus, Vita Apolloniae Tianensis 7.2, names Diogenes of Sinope as the hero of this anecdote. Demades, Duord, Ann 9.10 gives his own report of these events. 91. Diodorus has got ahead of himself. Lycurgus's service as finance minister belongs to the years 330-87, 327, 6 BCEE, Unst, Real Encyclopédie, 13, 1927, 24, 48, Feb. He was, however, almost 50 years old at this time, so a mature statesman. 92. This battle has already been mentioned, chaps. 62.4, 63.1. 93. For Archidamus, see chap. 63.2. For Aegis, Book 17.6324. 94. See chap. 36.3 and Book 20.77. 1. 95. Phrynichus was archon at Athens from July 337 to June 336 BCE. The consuls of 340 BCE were T. Manlius Imperiosus Tocrotus and P. Decius Mus, Broughton 1.135. 96. Key P. Books 11.29, 3 and 17.72, 6. For the events at Corinth Keep. Justin 9.5, 1-2. 97. Continued from chap. 83. E3. 98. Napos, Timoleon 5.4. Plutarch Timoleon 39.13 gives the same text of the decree except at the end, where, instead of mentioning freedom, he restored their laws to the Syracusan. These threefold agons were the highest form of heroic honors. See Habicht Gottmenschentum und Griechistat, 1956, pone 150. 99. This is the dynasty of Caius and Mysia, which later provided the kings of Pontus. Keep. Books 15.93 and note 20.111, 4. 100 Livy 8.11, 11 states that the battle took place inter sinuessum Minturnasc. For the event see Broughton 1.135. 101. The archon's name was Pythodolus, and his term ran from July 336 to June 335 BC. The Olympic Games were held in midsummer 336. The consuls of 399 BC were Thayer, Aemilius Mamercinus, and Q. Publilius Philo. Broughton 1.137. 102 continued from chap. 89. For these events, Seep. Justin 9.589. 103. The oracle is cited in the same form by Pausanias 8.76. 104. Justin 9.61. 105. Such protective decrees were common. C.P. Demosthenes, C. Aristoca. 95. The most famous being the decree of Aristocrates proposed in honor of Sosoboleptes in 353 BCE. 106. Nork Trag. Grays, Gray. Frag. 2. Adesp. 127. Burke, poet. Lear. Graius. 2. 3.744, 745. The idea has been thought Aeschylean. Lines 8-9 are quoted, with slight grammatical change, by Philodemus de Morte, Colonel 38.1214 D. Bassi, Papiri Esse Papyri Ercolanesi, 1, 1914. 107. P. Pone 101, Note 3. 108. He walked between the two Alexanders, his son and his son-in-law, Justin, 9.634, and so between those who had most reason to wish his death. 109. Justin, 9.648. The Orestes was a district in western Macedonia, bordering on Illyria. 110. This battle can hardly be identified in view of the many wars fought by Philip against the Illyrians. The last one mentioned by Diodorus was in chap. 69.7. 111. This is the usually stated relationship. In Book 17.23, Attalus is called Cleopatra's brother, but otherwise, with more probability, her uncle. 112. These events cannot be dated exactly, but they must have occurred some years before the assassination of Philip, perhaps as early as 344 BCE. Irv, Alexander Age, 2, 308. Pausanias waited a long time for his revenge, and it is curious that he chose the occasion most advantageous for Alexander. 113. No sophist Hermocrates is otherwise known at this time, but it may be possible to identify this man with the grammarian of the same name who is best known to fame as the teacher of Callimachus. For the latter, Kep. F. Susemichel, Geschichte der griechischen Literatur und der Alexandrinerzeit, 2, 1893, 668. O. Stalin W. Schmidt W. W. Schmidt W. von Christ's Geschichte der griechischen Literatur 6, 2.1 1920, 126, Funeol, Real Encyclopedia, 800. 114. The date of Philip's death is discussed by K.J. Belloc, Griechische Geschichte 2, 3.2, 1923, 59. The news had not yet reached Athens by the end of the civil year, 337-6 BCE. 1.240 in the 10th Prytany does not know of it. On the other hand, the time must be early in the summer, for Philip was busy with preparations for an invasion of Asia Minor. A possible clue to the date is furnished by the statement of Plutarch, Alexander, 16.2, concerning the Battle of the Granicus. This would have taken place in the month Dacius, but as that was unlucky, Alexander ordered the intercalation of a second Artemisius. Since there is some evidence that the intercalary month was the last month of the regnal year, This establishes a certain presumption that Philip died and Alexander came to the throne in Decius. And this squares well enough with the evidence of the Attic inscription. Since Alexander died in Decius, the Oxyrhynchus chronologist was correct in crediting him 13 years of reign. See below on Book 17.117, 5, 467, Note 1. 115, this is presumably the son of Andromenes, who like Leonatus and Perdiccas was a close friend and contemporary of Alexander. Probably they were his bodyguards and not Philip's. The term may be used loosely. Attalus was never one of Alexander's 7 or 8 bodyguards proper in Asia, and Leonatus not until 332-1, Perdiccas not until 332-1, Perdicandere, Alexander reach 1.27. Pausanias was from Orestis, and so were 2 of his slayers, while Attalus was Perdiccas's brother-in-law. It is tempting to suppose that they knew of Pausanias's plan and then killed him to silence him. Rue, Wilken, Spee, Ake, Berlin, 1923, 151f, would find in P. Oxy, 1798, evidence that Pausanias was tried and executed, but the text is fragmentary and obscure, and the theory is not, to mind, supported by Justin 11.21. 116, the implication of this claim on Philip's part was that he was in some fashion the equal of the 12 and entitled, like them, to worship. Son Thronos is an equivalent to Son Neos. What precisely this meant to Philip and his contemporaries is unknown. Sip. Habict, Gottesmenschentum, 14, Note 3. El Cerfo, J. Tondrial, Le Culte des Souverains dans la Civilisation Greco-Romaine, 1956, 123, 125. 117 Diodorus mentions none of the suspicion which attended to Olympias and Alexander concerning the assassination of Philip, and his judgment on Philip is more favourable than that of others. Cheap. Justin, 9.7, 8, and for the suspicion, Plutarch, Alexander, 9, 10. Arian, 3.65. 118 stated in chap. 1.1.3. Thayer's note. Aige, now Vagina, is the site of the Macedonian royal tombs, some of which were discovered intact in 1977, with the bodies of Alexander the Great's son and Philip Iei, or maybe Philip I. See this photo as Etia page at Livius. The previous, next to images with borders, lead to more information. The thicker the border, the more information. Details here. Up to Diodorus classical texts Lacuscurtius Homer page or image on this site is in the public domain only if its URL has a total of 1 asterisk. If the URL has 2 asterisks, the item is copyright someone else and used by permission or fair use. If the URL has none, the item is C. Bill Thayer. See my copyright page for details and contact information. Page updated 18 Feb 18.